3 days before my graduation party, my parents did not cancel it over money or emergencies. They canceled it because my sister Delaney cried over my full scholarship to Georgetown. Her feelings always mattered more. But they never knew I had been preparing my escape for years. When the party vanished, three hidden things surfaced. I found a stolen community fund, an unauthorized college portal change, and a tired social media lie. My name is Sienna Howard. I am 19 years old, and for my entire life, I have lived in a picture-perfect, quietly suffocating suburb of Raleigh, North Carolina. I just finished my senior year of high school. I did not just finish. I clawed my way to the very top of my class with a flawless academic record, surviving sleepless nights, endless study sessions, and a relentless schedule to secure a full scholarship to Georgetown University. It was my golden ticket out of a house where I always felt like a temporary guest. For over a month, our house had been transformed into a staging ground for a massive celebration. The preparations were extensive, loud, and undeniable. We had carefully addressed and mailed out 48 invitations to friends, teachers, and extended family members. A massive tiered cake with the Georgetown logo and blue and gray icing had been ordered and paid for at the local bakery. The backyard was currently strung with expensive rented patio lights, and heavy folding tables were already stacked in the garage waiting to be set up. More importantly, several people from our congregation and the surrounding neighborhood had already begun dropping by. They would stand in our foyer, pressing thick envelopes into my mother's hands, explicitly telling her to make sure I used the cash gifts to buy books and dorm supplies before I left for college. It was supposed to be my moment. It was supposed to be the one evening where the spotlight rested entirely on the future I had built with my own two hands. Then came the ambush. Exactly 3 days before the party, the atmosphere in the house shifted from festive to remarkably heavy. My mother, Colleen Howard, called me into the kitchen. The house was far too quiet, carrying that specific, tense silence that usually meant someone was actively managing a crisis. She stood by the marble island, meticulously wiping down a surface that was already spotless. Her voice possessed that maddening, calculated calmness she always used whenever she was about to drop a bomb and expected me to catch the shrapnel without making a sound. "Sienna, we are going to have to cancel the party on Saturday," she said. She did not even look up from her cleaning cloth. Her tone was casual, as if she were telling me we were out of milk or that it might rain tomorrow. I froze. I had a glass of cold water halfway to my mouth, and my hand simply stopped in midair. I stared at her, trying to process the absolute absurdity of her words. "Cancel it, Mom. The invitations are out. Everyone has already sent their response. The food is scheduled for delivery." She finally looked up at me, offering a tight, patronizing smile that did not reach her eyes. "I know it is incredibly disappointing for you, sweetie, but Delaney is struggling terribly right now. She simply cannot handle a whole evening where everyone is only talking about her sister. It is causing her severe anxiety. It is just too much pressure on her mental health to sit through an event focused entirely on you." I felt a familiar, suffocating tightening in my chest. My father, Grant Howard, was standing in the doorway leading to the formal dining room. He leaned heavily against the wooden frame, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He was playing his usual predictable role, the stoic enforcer of my mother's emotional decrees. "It is a necessary decision for family harmony. Sienna," he said. His tone was heavy with preemptive exhaustion, a clear warning telling me not to push back. "Do not make this harder than it has to be. You are going away to a great school. You have everything going for you right now. It is incredibly selfish of you to demand a lavish party when you know your sister is in a fragile state. Show some grace and be the bigger person." I looked past his broad shoulder. Out in the hallway, sitting halfway up the carpeted stairs, was my sister, Delaney. She was 17 years old, an aspiring theater kid whose ever-changing moods dictated the climate of our entire household. She was not crying loudly. She was not throwing a tantrum or playing the loud, demanding villain. She just sat there with her knees pulled up tightly to her chest, her eyes red and puffy, completely silent. It was infuriatingly ambiguous. I never truly knew if Delaney explicitly demanded these constant sacrifices, or if my parents just used her silent tears as a convenient, untouchable shield to control the narrative of our family dynamics. They always governed this house by whatever action made Delaney cry less. My achievements were always secondary to her comfort. I opened my mouth to argue. I wanted to scream. I wanted to point out that 48 people were expecting to show up in exactly 72 hours. I wanted to ask why her temporary sadness outweighed years of my hard work. But as I drew in a deep breath to launch my defense, my eyes drifted. I looked past my father, past the long oak dining room table, and my gaze landed on the vintage wooden buffet cabinet resting against the far wall. Something was wrong. Something crucial was missing. Since last week, there had been a beautiful decorative glass box sitting right in the center of that cabinet. It was the designated spot where my mother had been placing the cards and envelopes dropped off by our neighbors and church members. Congratulations cards. Cards with checks inside. Cards containing cash, meant to fund my dorm room essentials and travel expenses. Just the night before, I had distinctly seen a thick, heavy stack of white envelopes resting securely inside that transparent glass box. Now the glass box was completely empty. It was wiped clean. Not a single piece of paper remained. My mind clicked. The gears turned rapidly, and a sudden, sharp realization cut straight through the thick fog of my rising anger. The mysteriously missing money perfectly aligned with something else I had brushed off earlier that very same morning. I had received a strange, automated email notification from the Georgetown Housing Department confirming a change to my residential preferences. I had not logged into that student portal in weeks. I had absolutely not requested any changes to my housing status. Added to that unsettling detail was a missed call from Mr. Nolan Price, my university scholarship advisor, sitting unanswered on my voicemail since yesterday afternoon. They were waiting for me to explode. My father was physically bracing himself for a shouting match so he could justify grounding me and painting me as the villain. My mother was waiting for me to break down and cry so she could comfortably console me while still firmly denying me what I had earned. Delaney was waiting on the stairs, perhaps feeling genuinely guilty, or perhaps just quietly watching the show unfold from a safe distance. I looked back at the empty spot on the buffet cabinet. I looked at my mother's perfectly composed, expectant face. I thought about the compromised housing portal, the urgent missed call, and the missing envelopes filled with cash. This was not about a graduation party. This was not about Delaney feeling sad or overshadowed. Something entirely different, something deeply sinister, was happening. A massive, quiet theft of my independence was occurring right under my nose. This suddenly canceled party was just the convenient smokescreen they desperately needed. If there was no party, there would be no guests. If there were no guests, nobody would approach me to ask what I bought with their generous financial gifts. No one would expect me to write thank you notes for money I never received because I would never know I received it. I slowly placed my water glass down on the marble counter. The hot, frantic anger completely drained out of my body, instantly replaced by a cold, absolute, terrifying clarity. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice even a fraction of a decibel. "I understand," I said softly. My mother blinked, clearly thrown off balance by the total lack of resistance. She had been armed for a fight that was not coming. "You do?" "Yes," I replied, my voice perfectly steady and hollow. "If it is for family harmony, then of course, cancel it." My father visibly relaxed his posture against the doorframe, dropping his arms. A smug, victorious look of satisfaction washed over his face. "Good girl. I knew you would be mature about this." I turned and walked out of the kitchen. I passed my father without looking at him. I walked past Delaney sitting on the stairs, offering her a blank, unreadable stare that made her flinch, and quickly looked down at her socks. I went straight up the stairs, walked into my bedroom, and closed the door behind me. I heard the lock click firmly into place. That unnatural calmness was the exact moment Sienna Howard stopped being the dutiful daughter begging for scraps of fairness. I was completely done fighting for my place at their table. From that second forward, I stopped looking at them as my family. I started treating them as a crime scene I needed to meticulously pack up and escape from. In the carefully curated ecosystem of our family home, the hierarchy of needs was never a secret. Delaney was the delicate, exotic flower that required constant, meticulous climate control. She had been enrolled in elite performing arts academies since she was 7 years old, a hyper-competitive world that perfectly cultivated her dramatic mood swings and demanded an endless supply of my parents' time, money, and undivided attention. Her vocal coach alone cost $100 an hour, twice a week. Her summer theater camps required thousands of dollars in tuition, travel, and custom-tailored costumes. My parents gladly wrote those checks, viewing them as necessary investments in her fragile genius. Delaney's emotional state was the absolute barometer for our entire household. If she was stressed about a missed high note during a rehearsal, the house went completely silent. If she felt insecure about a minor casting decision, my parents cleared their weekend schedules to rebuild her confidence, taking her on shopping trips or out to expensive dinners just to coax out a smile. I, conversely, was the sturdy, neglected houseplant that somehow managed to thrive in the dark corner of the room. My unspoken role was to be completely, flawlessly self-sufficient, so my parents could pour all their emotional and financial resources into my sister. I maintained perfect grades without ever being reminded to open a textbook. I researched out of state universities, tracked down obscure application deadlines, drafted endless admission essays in the middle of the night, and politely cornered my high school teachers for recommendation letters, entirely on my own. Nobody ever offered to proofread my personal statements. Nobody ever suggested driving me to campus tours on a weekend. Whenever I brought home a glowing report card or a standardized test score ranking in the 99th percentile, my mother would offer a distracted, fleeting nod and say that of course I did well, because I was always fine. My academic success was not an achievement to be celebrated. It was a convenient baseline that required zero parental maintenance. I learned very early on that if I ever wanted a safety net in this life, I had to weave it myself, thread by thread. On my 16th birthday, while Delaney was having a lavish, catered dinner party with 20 of her drama club friends in our backyard, I walked downtown and applied for a part-time job at Mercer Lane Books and Print. It was a dusty, independently owned bookstore that also ran a surprisingly busy local printing, shipping, and notary service in the back room. That place quickly became my sanctuary and my true training ground. Working the busy print counter taught me more about the practical mechanics of the real world than a decade of high school classes ever could. I learned how to balance heavy cash drawers, how to process complicated international shipping manifests, and most importantly, how to organize, file, and protect physical and digital records. My manager was a sharp, fiercely observant woman named Naomi Pierce. Naomi had this uncanny ability to read people, and it took her less than a month to figure out exactly what kind of kid I was. She saw the unnatural, tightly coiled maturity of a teenager who had realized way too early that no adult was ever coming to rescue her. Naomi never pitied me. Pity was useless. Instead, she armed me. During the slow, rainy afternoons when the store was empty, she would pull up wooden stools behind the counter and teach me practical survival skills. She showed me how to read bank statements line by line, explaining how to spot hidden maintenance fees, track routing numbers, and dispute unauthorized charges. She taught me the critical importance of keeping redundant digital backups of every official document, using heavy-duty encryption, and never trusting a single password across multiple platforms. She told me once, sliding a freshly laminated copy of my Social Security card across the scratched glass counter, that nobody cares about my data, my money, or my future as much as I do. She told me to always keep my own receipts, both literal and metaphorical. Naomi was not the only adult who saw straight through the glossy suburban facade of my family dynamics. 2 years ago, during a rare, incredibly stifling Thanksgiving dinner at our house, my mother's older sister visited from Alexandria, Virginia. Aunt June Whittaker was everything my mother was not: pragmatic, entirely unimpressed by local theater politics, and sharp enough to notice who was actually doing the heavy lifting in our kitchen while everyone else relaxed in the living room. After dinner, while my parents were busy consoling Delaney over a minor, fabricated argument about the turkey carving, Aunt June found me washing the massive mountain of fine china by myself. She stood beside the sink, picked up a cotton towel, dried a gravy boat, and looked at me with a steady, grounding expression. She did not offer me empty, polite sympathies or try to psychoanalyze my parents' blatant favoritism. She just leaned in and said a single, vital sentence that I firmly anchored myself to for the next 24 months. "If you ever need a room, I always have one." That was all she said. There were no strings attached. There was no demand for a dramatic family confrontation or an emotional breakdown. It was just a quiet, solid exit door, deliberately left slightly ajar for the day I finally needed to walk through it. Knowing that door existed completely changed how I navigated the remaining time under my parents' roof. When it came time to actually submit my college applications, I operated like a ghost in my own home. I did not tell my family about the vast majority of the top-tier schools I applied to, nor did I mention the extensive, complicated financial aid forms I was filling out late at night using the computers at the bookstore. I understood the mechanics of my household too perfectly. In our house, information was a severe liability. The more my parents knew about my plans, the more opportunities there were for those plans to be inexplicably delayed, aggressively micromanaged, or somehow twisted into a long conversation about how my departure would emotionally impact Delaney. I paid every single application fee using the wages I had quietly saved at Mercer Lane. I routed all the critical physical mail to a secure postal box I rented downtown, ensuring that no university letters ever crossed our front porch for my mother to intercept. When the thick, heavy envelope from Georgetown University finally arrived, containing not just a prestigious acceptance letter, but an offer for a comprehensive full academic scholarship and a highly generous initial transition grant for living expenses, I did not run home to share the life-changing news. I did not scream with joy. I did not cry tears of relief. And I certainly did not expect a proud hug from my parents. I sat completely alone in my beat-up car in the post office parking lot, staring intensely at the embossed crest on the heavy paper. My very first instinct was not celebration, it was pure preservation. The very next morning, I walked into a different bank branch across town and opened a completely separate checking account under my name only. I did not use my home address. I used the bookstore's address. With Naomi's explicit permission and guidance, I deposited the initial transition grant check the exact moment it cleared. Then, I used the high-grade commercial scanners at work to digitize every single page of the Georgetown Scholarship Agreement, my financial aid award letters, my birth certificate, my passport, and my tax documents. I saved everything onto a heavily encrypted hard drive that I kept buried at the very bottom of my work backpack. I took the physical copies, organized them meticulously into a heavy-duty, fireproof document folio, and placed that folder in a very specific, calculated spot tucked securely inside the lining of my duffel bag, sitting right next to my bedroom door. I had been packing that bag in my head for years. Every time my father told me to stop being selfish and accommodate my sister, I mentally added a shirt. Every time my mother casually canceled my plans to cater to Delaney's unpredictable theater schedule, I packed a pair of shoes. I had been living in a constant state of quiet, hyper-vigilant preparation. The cancellation of my graduation party was not the inciting incident of my departure. It was not a sudden, shocking betrayal that broke a naive girl's heart and forced her into the cold world. It was simply the final, loud click of a lock snapping into place. It was the absolute confirmation that my carefully constructed exit strategy was no longer just a hypothetical backup plan to soothe my anxiety. It was an active, immediate necessity. I had lived within an inherently biased, parasitic system for so long that I had built my escape route years before they ever gave me the specific, unforgivable reason to use it. The very next morning, the house was completely still. I sat on the edge of my mattress, watching the early sunlight filter through the blinds, waiting until the clock hit exactly 9 in the morning on the East Coast. I picked up my phone, my hands remarkably steady, and dialed the direct extension for Mr. Nolan Price, my assigned scholarship advisor at Georgetown. He answered on the second ring, his tone carrying the standard, cheerful efficiency of a university administrator. He apologized for missing my call the previous day and asked if I was calling to confirm the external scholarship disbursements. I kept my voice light, aiming for casual curiosity. I told him I just wanted to make sure all my paperwork was in order before the fall semester began. There was a brief pause, accompanied by the muffled sound of a keyboard clacking on his end of the line. Then, Mr. Price delivered a sentence that caused the temperature in my bedroom to plummet. He informed me that the university had processed my main academic grants, but the supplemental community support funds, specifically the local alumni chapter grant and the Neighborhood Association Educational Award, had already been completely finalized. He cheerfully noted that my family had confirmed receipt of those specific external funds late last week, opting to have the checks mailed directly to my home address rather than routed through the university billing office. A heavy, suffocating coldness washed over my entire body. My fingers gripped the edges of my phone case so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had never authorized anyone to intercept my financial aid. I had never signed a single document allowing my parents to receive those specific checks. More chillingly, my parents had never breathed a single word to me about our neighbors, the local alumni, or the church congregation pooling together actual, physical money to support my transition to college. I forced a polite smile into my voice, thanked Mr. Price for his time, and ended the call before he could detect the sudden, sharp shift in my breathing. The moment the screen went black, I flipped open my laptop. I did not bother getting dressed or going downstairs for breakfast. I went straight to the Georgetown student portal. I typed in my credentials, my eyes scanning the dashboard the second the page loaded. I navigated directly to the residential life section. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked at my housing status. It was supposed to say confirmed, with a room assignment in one of the freshman dormitories. Instead, the status bar was shaded in a dull, alarming gray. The text read that my housing preference had been modified to a deferred assignment. My stomach dropped. In the competitive ecosystem of university housing, a deferred assignment essentially meant giving up a guaranteed bed. It meant being pushed to the very bottom of the wait list. If I did not fix this immediately, I would arrive in Washington with nowhere to sleep. My entire plan of leaving North Carolina would be completely derailed. I would be forced to take online classes from my childhood bedroom, trapped in the very house I was desperately trying to escape. I clicked on the account security settings, hunting for the digital footprint of the sabotage. I checked the recent login locations and the account recovery options. Right there, sitting under the primary contact methods, was a secondary recovery email address. It was not mine. It was an incredibly old, shared family email address that my mother used to register for grocery store loyalty programs and middle school newsletters a decade ago. It was an address I assumed had been abandoned for years. She had used it to bypass my security. She had requested a password reset, intercepted the confirmation link, logged into my university portal, and quietly pushed my departure date off a cliff. I spent the rest of the daylight hours acting entirely normal. I walked downstairs, made myself a sandwich, and politely navigated around Delaney, who was moping on the living room sofa. I did not look at my mother when she asked me to help fold the laundry. I moved through the house like a ghost, waiting for the sun to go down. At 2 in the morning, the house finally sank into a deep, uninterrupted silence. I slipped out of my bedroom, avoiding the third step on the staircase that always creaked. I moved like a shadow through the hallway, stepping into the formal dining room. The heavy oak buffet cabinet stood against the wall, its surface completely bare where the glass box of graduation cards used to sit. I crouched down, opening the heavy wooden drawers beneath the cabinet. This was where my mother kept the household administrative clutter, warranties, tax receipts, and her meticulously organized budgeting binders. I pulled out a thick floral embossed notebook that she used for managing seasonal expenses. I turned on the tiny flashlight on my phone, shielding the beam with my palm, and began flipping through the pages. I passed the tabs for groceries, home repairs, and Delaney's endless theater camp fees. Near the very back, tucked behind a folded utility bill, I found a loose sheet of lined paper. The handwriting was unmistakably my mother's elegant, looping cursive. At the very top of the page, she had written a title, Siena College Contributions. Below that heading was a meticulous, itemized ledger. It was a list of names, followed by specific monetary amounts. Mr. and Mrs. Gable, $500. The Grace Fellowship Education Committee, $3,000. The Raleigh Regional Alumni Network, $2,500. The list went on, detailing a dozen different local families and organizations. I ran my finger down the column of numbers, doing the mental math. The total sum at the bottom of the page was staggering. It was over $10,000. $10,000 meant for textbooks, winter coats, laptop upgrades, and emergency meals. $10,000 of pure, unadulterated independence, and there was not a single envelope, not a single check, not a single crisp bill attached to this piece of paper. The money had already been absorbed into the invisible machinery of the Howard family finances. Sitting there in the dark, clutching that piece of paper, the sudden cancellation of my graduation party violently snapped into focus. It suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. If my mother had hosted that party, 48 people would have walked into our backyard. Over half of those guests were the exact same people listed on this ledger. Within the first hour of the party, someone would have inevitably walked up to me with a plate of cake, hugged me, and asked what color sheets I was planning to buy with their $500 check. Someone from the church committee would have proudly asked how the $3,000 grant was helping with my tuition gap. They would have expected me to look them in the eye and say thank you. My mother could never let that happen. She could never risk a single guest asking a question I did not know how to answer. The party was an absolute liability. It was a ticking time bomb of financial exposure. So, she needed an excuse to shut the entire event down without raising a single red flag to the community. And she had the perfect, unimpeachable weapon right upstairs Delaney. My parents had not canceled the party because Delaney was crying on the stairs. They had likely engineered the tears, or at the very least, eagerly seized upon a minor mood swing, elevating it to a severe mental health crisis. Who could possibly argue with parents trying to protect their fragile, emotionally distressed younger daughter? It was the ultimate, bulletproof excuse. It allowed them to play the role of deeply concerned, protective parents to the outside world, while simultaneously shutting down the one event that would expose their theft. This realization shifted everything. The narrative I had told myself my entire life was that my parents simply favored my sister. I thought I was just the neglected child, the sturdy background character expected to survive on minimal affection. But looking at that ledger, the truth was far more sinister. They were not just ignoring me, they were actively mining my achievements. They were harvesting the goodwill, the respect, and the financial capital that my hard work had generated within our community, and they were funneling it directly into their own pockets to fund their preferred lifestyle. Changing my housing portal was the backup plan to ensure I stayed trapped in Raleigh, remaining a convenient, profitable asset under their roof for as long as possible. I took my phone, turned off the flashlight, and carefully photographed the entire ledger from 3 different angles. I made sure my mother's handwriting was perfectly legible. I tucked the paper exactly where I found it, closed the drawer, and crept back upstairs to my room. I did not feel heartbroken anymore. The pain of being a discarded daughter vanished entirely, replaced by the hyper-focused clarity of an auditor uncovering a massive corporate fraud. My parents thought they were executing a flawlessly clean administrative maneuver. They thought they had successfully weaponized the concept of family harmony to blindfold me, but they had left a paper trail. And from this moment forward, I was going to use their own meticulously kept secrets to absolutely dismantle their control over my life. Back in my room, the darkness felt thick and protective. I sat on the edge of my mattress, staring at the blank screen of my phone. I did not cry. My tear ducts felt like they had been completely hollowed out, replaced by a cold operational efficiency. I opened my messaging application and pulled up the contact profile for Aunt June. I did not type out a long, emotional paragraph explaining the betrayal. I did not ask for advice on how to confront my parents. I typed exactly 4 simple words. "Can I come now?" I hit send. I did not even have the chance to place the phone down on my nightstand before the screen illuminated the dark sheets. The reply was instantaneous, as if she had been sitting in Virginia with her phone in her hand, simply waiting for the inevitable moment the illusion shattered. "Room is ready." That was it. No questions asked. No demands for context. Just an open door. I stood up and pulled my large duffel bag from the top shelf of my closet. I did not pack like a teenager running away from home in a chaotic, dramatic frenzy. I moved with the precise, calculated rhythm of someone who was finally executing a deeply rehearsed evacuation protocol. I did not throw random clothes into the bag. I folded everything meticulously. First came the fireproof document folio I had hidden weeks ago. I unzipped it and ran my fingers over the contents, verifying every single piece of paper. My original birth certificate with the raised seal, my crisp blue Social Security card, the thick, embossed stack of official scholarship award letters from Georgetown, my passport. I placed the folio flat at the bottom of the bag. Next came my laptop, its charging cable, and the heavy encrypted external hard drive containing the scanned copies of every single application, tax return, and financial aid form I had ever submitted. I added my personal bank passbook, the small booklet that represented my only uncontested financial lifeline. Then, I packed the physical necessities. I packed exactly 7 days of practical, durable clothing. I packed 2 pairs of reliable shoes. I packed a heavy winter coat. Anticipating the cold winds of Washington, I deliberately left behind the sentimental items. I left the stuffed animals, the high school yearbooks, the framed photographs sitting on my desk. Those items were anchors to a house I no longer recognized. They were liabilities. It took me less than 60 minutes to completely erase 19 years of an emotional footprint from that bedroom. When I zipped the bag closed, the finality of the sound echoed in the quiet room. The next morning, the sun rose, casting long, pale shadows across the hallway. At exactly 6 o'clock, I grabbed the heavy straps of my duffel bag and the handle of a single rolling suitcase. I carried them down the stairs, ensuring the wheels did not bump against the wooden steps. I placed them neatly by the front door, right next to the coat rack. My mother walked out of the kitchen a few moments later, holding a steaming mug of coffee. She wore a perfectly pressed robe, looking relaxed and completely in control. She stopped and glanced at the luggage sitting by the door. Her facial expression did not shift into panic. She did not drop her mug or gasp. Instead, a small, patronizing smile touched the corners of her mouth. She genuinely believed I was just getting a head start on packing up my off-season clothes to put into the garage storage before I left for campus at the end of the summer. That assumption was profoundly revealing. The psychological conditioning in this house was so deeply entrenched that the absolute worst-case scenario in her mind was merely me being slightly overeager about organization. The concept of me actually walking out the door, entirely because of her actions, was a reality she was literally incapable of imagining. I walked past the bags and stepped into the kitchen. My father was sitting at the granite island, casually reading a news article on his digital tablet. "I am leaving," I said. My voice was completely flat. It carried no anger, no sorrow, and no invitation for debate. It was a simple statement of absolute fact. My mother turned around, gently resting her coffee mug on the counter. "Leaving for where so early?" she asked, her tone light and conversational. "I am moving to Alexandria," I replied, keeping my eyes locked firmly on hers. "Today, I need to finalize all my university paperwork directly with the admissions and housing offices in person." The shift in the room was violent and immediate. The light, conversational atmosphere evaporated, instantly replaced by a rigid, suffocating tension. My mother's patronizing smile vanished completely. A flash of pure, silent panic darted across her eyes before she quickly masked it. She knew exactly what it meant if I physically walked into the Georgetown housing office. She looked frantically toward the kitchen island. My father dropped his tablet onto the hard surface with a loud, aggressive thud. He immediately stood up, puffing out his chest and squaring his broad shoulders, automatically defaulting to his preferred tactic of physical intimidation and coercive volume. "You are not going anywhere," he commanded, his voice rumbling with forced authority. "You are blowing this entirely out of proportion. We made a necessary family decision about a minor social event last night, and now you are throwing a childish, spiteful tantrum. You are going to take those bags back upstairs immediately, and we are going to sit down and talk about your attitude." Soft footsteps padded heavily against the hardwood floor just outside the kitchen archway. I turned my head slightly. Delaney was standing near the bottom of the staircase. She was wearing an oversized sleep shirt, her face completely bare of makeup. For the first time in years, she was not actively performing a role. She was not the tragic victim, and she was not the center of attention. She looked genuinely, profoundly horrified. Her wide eyes flicked rapidly from the heavy luggage sitting by the door to my father's red face, and finally to my completely expressionless posture. The reality of the situation was finally crashing down on her shoulders. The decisions made the previous night were no longer just about canceling a caterer so she could feel better about herself. She suddenly realized that her tears had been the catalyst that was currently dismantling the entire structural foundation of her comfortable, insulated world. She was watching the protective shield she had always hidden behind, prepare to walk out the front door forever. My father took a heavy step forward, raising his voice even louder, demanding that I explain my blatant disrespect and demanding that I apologize to my mother for causing unnecessary morning stress. I stood my ground. I did not shout back. I did not reach into my pocket to pull out the digital photographs of the handwritten ledger. I did not scream about the thousands of dollars in stolen community funds, and I did not mention the manipulated secondary recovery email on my university housing portal. Throwing those specific accusations into the air would have been a massive tactical error. It would have given them a tangible script to fight against. It would have given my father something specific to aggressively deny. It would have given my mother a reason to cry and claim a misunderstanding, and it would have provided them with the necessary ammunition to keep me trapped in that kitchen in an endless, draining argument. Instead, I looked directly into my mother's wide, terrified eyes. I let the heavy silence stretch out for 3 long seconds, ensuring she felt the full weight of my gaze. "I am not leaving because of the party," I said. Every single syllable was carefully articulated and coated in absolute ice. "I am leaving because I understand exactly what is going on." The effect was instantaneous. The remaining color completely drained from my mother's face, leaving her looking hollow and pale. She opened her mouth slightly, but no sound came out. She knew. In that exact, terrifying fraction of a second, staring into my cold eyes, she realized that I knew everything. The ledger, the portal, the missing envelopes. The silence was far more devastating than any screaming match could have ever been. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back to them, breaking the invisible tether that had held me in that house my entire life. I walked down the short hallway, grabbed the handles of my bags, and pushed the heavy wooden front door wide open. The crisp morning air hit my face. My father was yelling something behind me, a desperate, trailing string of commands and vague threats about consequences, but his voice already sounded incredibly distant, small, and entirely powerless. I loaded my bags into the trunk of my car, shutting the metal lid with a solid, satisfying slam that echoed down the quiet suburban street. I got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. I did not check the rearview mirror even once. As I drove away from the neighborhood, the oppressive weight in my chest finally lifted. For the very first time in my existence, the absolute power dynamic of our family had completely inverted. I did not win by screaming louder or arguing better. I won because they were still standing in the kitchen desperately trying to talk, and I was simply no longer there to listen. The drive up Interstate 95 took exactly 4.5 hours. Aunt June lived in a beautifully restored brick townhouse in Alexandria, Virginia. When I finally pulled my car into her narrow driveway, she was already standing on the front porch waiting for me. We did not share a tearful, dramatic embrace. She simply walked down the steps, took the handle of my rolling suitcase, handed me a tall glass of iced water, and pointed directly toward the heavy mahogany dining table sitting in the center of her kitchen. There was absolutely no time allocated for emotional breakdowns. I did not retreat to the guest bedroom to bury my face in a pillow and cry over my shattered family. The exact moment I sat down at that solid wooden table, I opened my laptop and connected to her secure wireless network. This house was not a sanctuary for hiding, it was a designated war room. My very first call was to the Georgetown University Information Technology Security Desk. I bypassed the standard student helpline and navigated directly to the Fraud and Identity Division. A technician answered the phone, and I immediately explained that my student portal had been severely compromised. He verified my identity using my social security number and the original application PIN I had memorized several months ago. The technician pulled up the system access logs, his rapid keystrokes echoing clearly through the speakerphone. He confirmed that over the past 72 hours, there had been 2 separate, successful attempts to change my primary contact email address. Furthermore, he flagged a pending administrative request submitted just yesterday afternoon. It was an explicit attempt to alter the direct deposit routing information for my upcoming fall semester textbook refund grant, trying to divert the university funds away from my student account. I asked him to read the IP address and the specific device type associated with those unauthorized changes. He read off the hardware specifications of an older desktop computer operating on a local Raleigh residential network. It was the exact machine currently sitting in my father's home office. I instructed the technician to instantly revoke all current access tokens, lock the portal, and reset the password using a randomly generated 16-character alphanumeric code that I wrote down on a physical yellow notepad. Aunt June sat across from me, sipping black coffee from a ceramic mug. She possessed a terrifying, surgical understanding of bureaucratic defense systems. She slid a fresh legal pad across the table toward me. "We are not just locking the school accounts," she said, her voice crisp and commanding. "We are building a fortress around your entire identity." For the next 2 hours, she guided me through a rigorous, uncompromising digital lockdown. We contacted all 3 major credit reporting agencies. I placed a hard security freeze on my credit profile, ensuring that my parents could not secretly open any unauthorized loans or credit cards in my name to siphon more funds. I systematically removed my old cellular number from every banking, educational, and medical account I possessed, replacing the standard text message verification process with a high encryption authenticator application installed directly onto my mobile device. Aunt June then had me draft a formal, legally binding directive. We emailed the document directly to the Georgetown Registrar, the Financial Aid Office, and the Campus Housing Department. The directive explicitly stated that I was the sole authorized party for all administrative and financial matters, and that any future communication originating from Colleen or Grant Howard was to be immediately flagged as an unauthorized third-party inquiry and strictly ignored. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my head was throbbing with a dull ache, but the pure adrenaline kept my hands perfectly steady. I stepped out onto the back patio to get some fresh air and called Naomi at the bookstore. I needed to let my manager know I would not be returning for my scheduled shifts for the remainder of the summer. When I gave Naomi a brief, highly sanitized version of my sudden relocation, she let out a long, heavy exhale. She did not sound surprised at all. Instead, she offered a piece of information that made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. Naomi told me that just 4 days ago, my mother had stopped by the print shop. Colleen had leaned over the counter and casually asked Naomi for advice on graduation etiquette. Specifically, my mother had inquired if it was considered more polite for community guests to bring physical cash or write checks. My mother had added a chilling justification, telling Naomi that she wanted to make sure it was easy for the family to manage and deposit the funds on my behalf, so I would not have to stress about banking before college. My mother had been actively crowdsourcing the most efficient way to steal from me. The sudden cancellation of the party was absolutely not a spontaneous reaction to my sister crying on the stairs. The financial interception had been premeditated, researched, and carefully planned out days in advance. Armed with this dark new context, I immediately contacted my regional bank. I did not have access to my parents' joint accounts, but I knew the local branch staff because I had deposited my bookstore paychecks there for 2 years before opening my secret independent account. I called the branch directly and spoke to a clerk. I explained that I was trying to track down a specific educational grant check issued by the local alumni association, claiming I needed to verify the routing for my upcoming scholarship tax records. After a brief hold, the clerk returned to the line. She confirmed that a check from the Raleigh Regional Alumni Network, made out for the amount of $2,500, had indeed been processed by their branch earlier that week. I politely asked her to read the memo line written on the bottom left corner of the physical check. It says, "For Sienna's college start." The clerk cheerfully replied. I then asked which specific account number the check had been deposited into. She hesitated for a moment, citing internal privacy policies, but eventually confirmed it had absolutely not been deposited into my personal student checking account. It had been endorsed and swept directly into the Howard family joint savings account. They had taken a massive check with my name and my future explicitly written on it, and they had simply swallowed it whole. I hung up the phone and walked back into the dining room. I did not scream. I did not throw my phone against the brick wall. The betrayal had entirely transcended emotional pain. It was now a purely logistical problem that required solving. I opened a new, highly encrypted digital folder on my desktop. I named it simply The Ledger. Inside that folder, I began to build my arsenal. I created a meticulous spreadsheet logging every single date, every timestamp, and every specific monetary amount I had uncovered since leaving the house. I uploaded the dark, shadowy photographs of the handwritten list I had found in the dining room buffet the night before. I took screenshots of the unauthorized login attempts from the university IT department. I cataloged the names of the community members who had donated, the exact wording on the stolen checks, and the confirming emails from the school. Sitting there at Aunt June's table, sorting methodically through the raw data, a profound psychological realization washed over me. For my entire 19 years of existence, my parents had viewed me as the child who required absolutely nothing. I was low maintenance. I was self-sustaining. Therefore, when my silent, relentless hard work suddenly generated tangible prestige and actual financial capital within our community, they did not view it as my personal achievement. They viewed it as a newly discovered natural resource situated on family property. They felt entirely entitled to mine it, manage it, and redistribute it to fund the perpetual emotional maintenance of my sister. This was the exact moment my ultimate strategy crystallized. If I called them on the phone crying, they would call me hysterical. If I yelled at them, they would comfortably label me a disrespectful teenager. If I tried to appeal to their sense of morality, they would easily twist the narrative and make themselves the tragic victims of an ungrateful daughter. I was not going to fight a chaotic, emotional war on their chosen battlefield. I was going to wage a devastatingly civilized, entirely bureaucratic campaign. I was going to take the dirty secrets they firmly believed were safely buried under the protective guise of private family matters, and I was going to systematically transform them into a cold, irrefutable chain of documented data. Numbers do not care about family harmony. Paper trails do not care about Delaney's theatrical tears. And I was going to use every single piece of that paper to completely dismantle the control they thought they had over my life. For the first 72 hours after I arrived in Virginia, my mobile phone became an active, glowing battlefield. I did not block my family immediately. Aunt June and I had agreed that letting them speak into the void was the most effective way to gather intelligence. They were desperate to control the narrative, and desperate people always make mistakes. My mother chose the auditory route. leaving a steady stream of calculated voicemails. The first three audio messages were masterful performances of maternal distress. Her voice was pitched perfectly, dripping with a manufactured, tearful anxiety. She said she was incredibly worried about my safety. She begged me to just call home so they could know I was alive. She insisted that everyone in the house missed me terribly, and that whatever minor misunderstanding we had experienced could be easily fixed with a simple conversation. If anyone else had listened to those first three recordings, they would have heard a heartbroken mother pleading with a rebellious teenager. But my mother lacked stamina. By the fourth voicemail, the sickly sweet veneer cracked completely. Her tone shifted from wounded to sharply impatient. She stopped talking about my safety and pivoted entirely to the actual problem at hand. She sharply demanded that I return to North Carolina immediately because this silent treatment was making Delaney incredibly fragile. That single word was the fatal flaw in her performance: fragile. It was never about me leaving. It was exclusively about how my absence inconvenienced my sister. My mother had accidentally recorded the exact dynamic I had fled, neatly packaging her blatant favoritism into a 30-second audio clip that I immediately saved to my encrypted external drive. My father, on the other hand, did not bother with the illusion of warmth. He preferred the brutal efficiency of text messages. His messages were short, harsh, and entirely devoid of affection. He did not ask if I was safe. He typed that I was deliberately tearing our family apart right at the exact moment everyone needed to be united. He ordered me to stop being selfish, come back home, and apologize for causing such unprecedented chaos. Reading his texts, a cold realization settled over me. He was inadvertently confirming what I had known for years. In his eyes, my compliance and my silence were not choices. They were my mandatory obligations. My only purpose in that household was to absorb the shockwaves so the rest of them could live comfortably. Then came the message that completely shattered any lingering illusion I had about my younger sister being an innocent bystander. For 2 days, Delaney had been a ghost. Then, on the evening of the third day, my phone vibrated with a text from her number. It was not an apology. It was not a plea for me to come home. She sent a painfully casual message asking if the massive cash deposit my parents had lost on the catering and the backyard lighting rentals for my canceled graduation party could somehow be transferred to cover her summer theater showcase registration fee. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the sentence 4 times to ensure I was not hallucinating. It was a breathtaking display of entitlement. I suddenly understood that Delaney was not merely a passive victim of our parents' coddling. She was an active participant in the ecosystem. She saw the smoking crater of my ruined graduation, and her immediate, instinctual reaction was to scavenge the wreckage to fund her own hobbies. She knew exactly how the financial mechanics of our family operated. I did not reply. I locked my phone and slid it across the wooden dining table. My silence must have terrified her, because less than 12 hours later, Delaney escalated the situation to the public arena. If she could not manipulate me privately, she was going to martyr herself digitally. She posted a massive, multi-paragraph story on her primary social media feed. She used a somber, black and white filter over a candid photograph of our front porch. The text below the image was a masterclass in weaponized victimhood. She spun a tragic, sweeping tale about how her older sister had suddenly run away without a single word of warning right before leaving for university. She claimed my abrupt departure had left the entire family completely shattered. She painted herself as the confused, abandoned younger sibling, left behind to pick up the pieces of a broken home. She lamented the loss of our sisterly bond and asked her followers for prayers during this incredibly difficult season of unprecedented family stress. It was designed to generate a flood of sympathy, and for the first hour, it worked. Her theater friends flooded the comments with heart emojis and generic words of comfort, but Delaney had made a catastrophic, unforced error. She was 17 years old and lacked the sophistication to craft her own public relations strategy. Instead of speaking like a teenager, she heavily borrowed the exact same sanitized, corporate-sounding language my parents had been feeding the neighbors and the church congregation for the past week. She used phrases like family harmony, necessary privacy, and difficult transitions. The adults in our community were not stupid. They had been watching the Howard family dynamics play out at school events, Sunday services, and neighborhood block parties for over a decade. They recognized my mother's specific vocabulary echoing through Delaney's dramatic post. It felt entirely manufactured, and that artificiality immediately drew suspicion. The first crack in their digital armor came from a highly unexpected source. Mrs. Talia Voss, my advanced placement history teacher for the past 3 years, rarely engaged with students on social media. But she made an exception that afternoon. Mrs. Voss did not write a long, emotional defense. She posted a single, surgically precise comment right at the top of the thread. She wrote that she had taught Sienna for 3 consecutive years, and based on my impeccable character and work ethic, she firmly believed this public narrative was missing some highly important details regarding my full academic scholarship and the highly suspicious, sudden cancellation of my graduation celebration. That single comment from a respected, neutral authority figure acted like a spark in a room full of gasoline. The illusion of the shattered, innocent family instantly evaporated. People who had been quietly whispering behind closed doors suddenly felt emboldened to ask their questions in the public square. 10 minutes after the teacher commented, a prominent parent from the local high school alumni association chimed in. He publicly reminded everyone in the thread that the neighborhood community had recently pooled together a significant amount of money to support my transition to college. He stated that it seemed incredibly odd for a student to simply vanish without acknowledging those generous financial gifts. Then, the absolute fatal blow landed. A senior member of our church congregation, a woman who had personally handed my mother a thick envelope just a week prior, bypassed all the polite social pleasantries. She replied directly to Delaney's post with a blunt, devastating question. She simply asked if the substantial community funds collected for my education had ever actually reached my hands before I supposedly ran away. The comment section rapidly transformed into a digital interrogation room. Neighbors began comparing notes in real time. People started asking why a graduation party would be completely canceled if I was the one who had supposedly abandoned the family without warning. The timeline Delaney presented was being actively dismantled by the very people my parents had been trying to deceive. Panic clearly set in back in North Carolina. Delaney deleted the entire post in less than 48 hours. The page simply vanished, replaced by an error screen. But in the modern era, deleting a post is an admission of guilt, and nothing is ever truly erased. The damage was permanently done. Dozens of people had already taken high-resolution screenshots of her tragic essay. Mrs. Voss's sharp rebuttal, and the highly specific questions regarding the missing community funds. Those digital images were currently being forwarded through neighborhood group messages, alumni email chains, and local church forums. Sitting safely in Virginia, I watched the entire collapse unfold on my screen without having to type a single word. My parents had spent my entire life controlling the narrative of our household by speaking louder than me, talking over me, and demanding my silence. But the moment they tried to export that same fabricated story to the outside world, it completely fell apart. For the very first time, the Howard family lost absolute control over their own reputation. They did not lose it because I threw a tantrum or launched a messy, public counterattack. They lost it because the community finally took a collective step back, looked at the undeniable facts, and simply refused to believe the lie anymore. Aunt June poured herself another cup of coffee and looked at my screen. She had watched the social media disaster unfold with a completely neutral expression. When I moved my cursor toward the button to create my own public post, her hand gently covered mine. She shook her head. "We do not fight in the mud," she said. "If you post a defense online, it becomes a high school drama. You become just another angry teenager shouting into the void. We are going to handle this like adults conducting an audit. We are going to send thank you notes." It was a brilliantly terrifying strategy. I opened my email client and created a new, blank message. I did not use the group messaging feature. I addressed each email individually. pulling the names and contact information directly from the digital photographs of my mother's handwritten ledger. The subject line was simple: a sincere thank you regarding my college transition. The body of the email was meticulously crafted. It was completely devoid of anger, accusations, or dramatic reveals. I wrote that as I was finalizing my financial aid documents in Virginia. I had only very recently been made aware of their incredible generosity. I expressed my deepest gratitude for their support of my academic journey. Then came the final, surgical sentence. I casually mentioned that I was currently in the process of auditing my university accounts and verifying the receipt pipeline for all external contributions, so I would be reaching out again once I could personally confirm their specific gift had safely cleared into my student portal. It was polite, it was professional, and it carried a massive, undeniable implication. It told every single donor that their money was missing. I hit send on 22 separate emails. Then, we waited. The response time was staggering. It did not take days to hear back. It took less than 45 minutes. The first reply came from Mr. Gable, a retired structural engineer who lived 3 streets over from our house. He did not just send a polite acknowledgement, he attached a scanned, high-resolution image of a canceled check for $500. Right across the back of the check was my mother's unmistakable signature, authorizing the deposit into a joint account. His attached message was short and deeply concerned. He wrote that my mother had explicitly told him she was collecting all the gifts to set up a unified educational trust for me, to save me the administrative headache. Within 2 hours, my inbox was flooded with similar replies. People were sending screenshots of bank transfer receipts, copies of cashier checks, and forwarded email chains. The most damning piece of evidence came from the head of the local alumni chapter. She forwarded an email my mother had sent her 2 weeks prior. In that message, my mother cheerfully explained that since I was so overwhelmed with packing, the family had decided to pool all the community gifts together into one central family account to ensure everything was properly allocated for my textbooks and travel expenses. By simply saying thank you, I had forced every single donor to look directly at the reality of where their money had actually gone. The fallout spread through the community like a quiet, fast-moving fire. The Grace Fellowship Education Committee, a prominent group within our church, suddenly found themselves in an incredibly compromising position. They had issued a grant of $3,000 intended specifically for a graduating senior. However, my mother served on the volunteer board that helped organize the church community outreach events. By the end of the day, the head pastor had to convene an emergency meeting with the church treasurer. They could not simply ignore the fact that a massive check had been intercepted by one of their own organizers under false pretenses. The awkwardness within the congregation was palpable, thick with the sudden realization that their charitable system had been blatantly exploited. The institutional pressure did not stop at the church doors. The internal bank inquiry I had triggered the previous day rapidly escalated. Because several of the deposited checks contained explicit memo lines designating the funds for my specific educational use, and because those checks had been diverted into an account where I was not listed as a primary beneficiary, the bank's fraud detection algorithms flagged the transactions. The branch manager placed a temporary administrative hold on the Howard Family Joint Savings Account, pending a full verification review. My father tried to contain the rapidly expanding disaster using his standard brand of overbearing patriarchal logic. Through a forwarded text message sent to Aunt June by a mutual family friend, I saw exactly how he was trying to spin the narrative. He was telling anyone who would listen that the entire situation was a ridiculous overreaction to standard household budgeting. He argued that money going into one family house is ultimately used for the benefit of the children living in it. He claimed they were just temporarily holding the funds to cover the lost deposits from the canceled party and my future travel costs. But that argument held absolutely no weight. Legal and moral definitions do not bend to accommodate an arrogant father trying to justify theft. The community had not donated to the Howard Family General Living Fund. They had donated to Sienna Howard. And every single document proved that Sienna Howard had been entirely cut out of the transaction. The most significant casualty of this financial lockdown however, was not my parents' reputation. It was Delaney. For her entire life, Delaney had been comfortably insulated from the financial realities of our household. Her elite theater programs, her private vocal lessons, and her expensive summer showcases simply materialized whenever she demanded them. She had never once had to consider where the money came from. On the fourth day of my stay in Virginia, the prestigious Summer Performing Arts Academy, where Delaney was scheduled to spend July, sent out their final billing notices. Her registration required a deposit of $2,000. Because my parents' joint savings account was currently frozen under the bank's internal review, the automatic payment linked to my father's debit card was immediately declined. The Academy sent an automated email to Delaney, informing her that her coveted showcase slot had been officially suspended due to non-payment. For the first time in 17 years, Delaney slammed directly into a wall that her tears could not dissolve. She could not cry her way into a paid registration. The protective bubble our parents had built around her completely popped. She was suddenly forced to confront the terrifying possibility that the luxurious, pampered lifestyle she had always enjoyed was heavily subsidized by resources that did not actually belong to her or our parents. The brilliant, poetic justice of the situation was that Delaney did not direct her anger at me. I was completely removed from the equation. I was hundreds of miles away, sitting quietly in Alexandria. I had not canceled her payment. I had not locked the bank account. I had simply asked for what was legally and ethically mine. Delaney finally realized that her dramatic performance on the staircase 3 days before my graduation was nothing more than a convenient, manufactured excuse. She understood that my parents had completely weaponized her emotional volatility. They had needed a distraction, a loud, undeniable reason to cancel a party that would expose their financial interception. They had looked at their younger daughter, saw a teenager prone to jealousy and anxiety, and decided she was the perfect human shield for their embezzlement. She was not the center of their universe. She was just an incredibly useful tool for their financial scheme. The realization that her own parents had allowed her to publicly humiliate herself, allowed her to destroy her relationship with her only sister, and allowed her to post a fabricated story online just to cover up their stolen cash, finally broke the spell. Delaney was absolutely furious, and for the very first time in her life, that fury was pointed squarely at the two people sitting in the kitchen back in Raleigh. Exactly 1 week before my scheduled relocation to the university campus in Washington, I was forced to return to Raleigh for one final, unavoidable obligation. It was the annual Senior Honors and Academic Awards banquet. I did not want to step foot back into that town, but skipping the ceremony would have looked like a retreat. It would have given my parents the opportunity to stand in the lobby and play the role of the grieving, abandoned parents to a captive audience. I could not allow them to control the physical space in my absence. I did not drive down alone, and I absolutely did not coordinate my arrival with my family. Aunt June drove me in her quiet, dark sedan. We arrived at the high school auditorium exactly 15 minutes before the opening remarks. The atmosphere inside the massive, echoing hall was suffocatingly tense. By this point, the entire suburban ecosystem had vaguely pieced together that a severe fracture had occurred within the Howard household. They had seen the deleted social media posts. They had received my polite emails regarding the missing funds, and the church elders were well aware of the frozen bank accounts. However, nobody possessed the complete, unvarnished picture. My sudden calm appearance walking through the double doors alongside my aunt, rather than trailing obediently behind my mother and father, caused a visible ripple through the crowded room. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Heads turned. The air grew as tight and fragile as a pulled violin string. I wore a simple, tailored navy dress and kept my posture perfectly straight. Aunt June walked beside me like a formidable bodyguard, projecting an aura of absolute, unapproachable authority. We found 2 empty seats near the middle aisle, deliberately avoiding the designated family sections near the front. It took me less than 3 minutes to locate my parents. They were seated 4 rows closer to the stage. My mother was wearing a brightly colored floral blouse, aggressively attempting to project a vibrant, happy normalcy. She kept turning around, smiling brightly at the people passing by, trying desperately to make eye contact and exchange pleasantries. My father sat stiffly beside her, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw locked in a rigid line of forced indifference. Every single person in that auditorium recognized the performance. They saw the frantic, brittle edge to my mother's smile. They saw the defensive posture of my father. More importantly, they saw that I was sitting entirely separate from them, existing as a sovereign individual, completely untethered from their manufactured family unit. The ceremony progressed through the standard departmental awards and athletic recognitions. Then, the high school principal stepped up to the wooden podium. He adjusted his microphone, looking out over the silent crowd, and cleared his throat. He announced that before concluding the evening, there was a special presentation regarding the Community Academic Endowment. He spoke with careful, deliberate diplomacy, stating that due to an unexpected, highly unfortunate administrative glitch regarding previously allocated external scholarships, a dedicated coalition of local alumni and neighborhood sponsors had stepped forward to ensure a graduating senior was not penalized for circumstances entirely outside of her control. He called my name. He announced that this newly formed coalition had successfully established a secure direct replacement fund specifically for my transition to Georgetown. The applause that followed was not the standard, polite clapping reserved for academic achievements. It was thunderous, heavy, and profoundly pointed. It rolled through the auditorium in waves, lasting far too long for it to be considered normal. It was a collective, public statement. The community was using their applause to explicitly reject the lies my parents had tried to sell them. I stood up, nodded respectfully to the principal, and sat back down. I did not look at my parents. I did not need to. I could feel the sheer, crushing weight of their public humiliation from 4 rows away. They were trapped in their seats, forced to sit in silence while hundreds of their peers loudly celebrated the very independence they had tried so desperately to steal. They had to pretend they did not hear the underlying condemnation echoing in every single clap. Immediately following the conclusion of the ceremony, Aunt June and I bypassed the crowded reception in the gymnasium. We walked down a quiet, empty hallway toward the guidance counselor offices. Standing outside a locked door, waiting for us, was Mrs. Evelyn Brooks. Evelyn was a formidable, sharply dressed woman who served as the head of the neighborhood community sponsor group. She did not waste time with superficial greetings. She unlocked a vacant conference room, ushered us inside, and closed the door firmly, shutting out the noise of the lingering crowds. She sat across from me at the circular table, folding her hands neatly over her leather portfolio. Evelyn looked directly into my eyes and asked me exactly how far I wanted to take the issue of the original, misappropriated funds. She outlined my options with terrifying clarity. She offered the full weight of the community coalition if I wanted to pursue formal civil litigation against my parents. She offered public exposure, suggesting they could formally petition the church board to remove my mother from all financial volunteer positions. Or, she offered a slightly quieter, but equally severe route, a strict demand for full financial restitution paired with a legally binding written confession. I considered her offer carefully. I did not want a messy, prolonged courtroom battle that would drag my name through the local newspapers for the next 2 years. I also did not want the cheap, fleeting satisfaction of a public screaming match. I chose the most devastatingly bureaucratic path. I looked at Evelyn and stated my terms. I wanted everything placed permanently on the record. I wanted a legally binding repayment plan drafted by an attorney. I wanted every single stolen dollar accounted for, verified in writing, with the correct dates, the correct names of the donors, and my name explicitly listed as the sole rightful recipient. I wanted their theft transformed from a whispered neighborhood rumor into an undeniable, documented legal liability. I was not going to destroy them with a scandal. I was going to quietly, methodically suffocate their financial leverage. Evelyn nodded slowly, a deep look of respect crossing her face, and agreed to facilitate the paperwork through the coalition's legal counsel. Aunt June and I left the school building through a side exit, stepping out into the warm, humid night air. We walked across the dimly lit asphalt of the parking lot toward her car. As we approached the vehicle, a shadow detached itself from the side of a nearby van. It was Delaney. She looked entirely different from the girl who had cried on the stairs a week ago. She was not wearing a carefully selected outfit. She was wearing a simple gray hooded sweatshirt, her arms wrapped tightly around her own waist. She looked small, deflated, and incredibly tired. She stepped directly into our path, blocking the driver's side door. Aunt June stopped, her posture stiffening, but I placed a hand on my aunt's arm, signaling for her to wait. Delaney looked up at me, her eyes completely devoid of their usual theatrical sparkle. For the very first time in our entire lives as siblings, she spoke a raw, unvarnished truth. She told me, her voice trembling slightly, that she genuinely did not know our parents had touched my college money. She swore she had no idea they were intercepting checks or altering my university housing portals. But then, she took a shaky breath and confessed the part that actually mattered. She admitted that she knew perfectly well the graduation party was canceled because of her. She knew our parents were using her bad mood as an excuse to shut down my celebration, and she had stood by and let it happen because she liked being the center of their attention. She admitted she had enjoyed the power of making everything stop just because she was upset. She stood there in the dark parking lot, finally holding her own guilt, waiting for me to scream at her. She was bracing for an explosive, dramatic fight, because that was the only language our household had ever spoken. I did not raise my voice, I did not insult her, and I did not offer her absolution. I looked at her, feeling a strange, hollow pity for the sheltered, manipulative girl our parents had created. "Your crying did not cancel my future," I said. My voice was quiet, completely steady, and razor sharp. "The adults did that. They stole from me, and then they used you as a convenient, pathetic excuse to hide their tracks. You were never the priority, Delaney. You were just their camouflage." I watched the words hit her. I watched the final, devastating realization settle behind her eyes. I had completely stripped away her favorite role. She could no longer hide behind the identity of the highly sensitive, overly emotional younger sister who just needed extra care. She was forced to recognize that she was merely a pawn in a much darker, much more calculated game played by the people she trusted most. I stepped around her, opened the passenger door of Aunt June's car, and got inside. Delaney did not try to stop me again. She just stood frozen on the asphalt, entirely alone in the dark, as we backed out of the parking space and drove out of the town limits for the final time. Moving into my dormitory at Georgetown University felt less like a relocation and more like an atmospheric decompression. For 19 years, I had existed in an environment where every single personal victory had to be carefully minimized, actively hidden, or immediately followed by an apology so it would not accidentally cast a shadow over my sister. Stepping onto that historic campus in Washington was the first time in my life I entered a space where my ambition did not require a permission slip to simply exist. The sheer, uncomplicated normalcy of my new reality was profoundly disorienting. It was far more dizzying than the heavy reading loads or the rigorous academic schedule of my freshman classes. When I scored a perfect grade on my first political science midterm, nobody in my dorm suite sighed heavily or asked me to keep my voice down. My roommate simply high-fived me and offered to buy me a coffee. There was no emotional tax levied on my success. I did not have to pay for my achievements by constantly managing someone else's fragile self-esteem. That absolute absence of psychological friction was so foreign it almost felt like a trap, leaving me instinctively waiting for a punishment that simply never arrived. To cover my personal expenses and maintain the financial independence I had so ruthlessly secured, I took a federal work-study position at the main campus library. It was a quiet, methodical job sorting archives and managing the digital checkout system. It was there, amidst the towering stacks of dusty academic journals, that I met Mara Ellis. Mara was a sophomore from Chicago with a sharp, analytical mind and absolutely zero tolerance for suburban melodrama. One rainy Tuesday evening, during a slow shift at the circulation desk, I finally told her the truth about my departure from North Carolina. I braced myself for the standard, socially polite responses I had heard my entire life. I expected her to tilt her head, offer a sympathetic smile, and say that surely it was not that bad, or that my parents were probably just stressed and doing their best. People who grew up in healthy homes usually default to defending the institution of family, unable to comprehend that some parents are entirely transactional. Mara did not do any of that. She listened to the entire sequence of events, from the stolen checks to the manipulated housing portal. When I finished, she simply looked at me across the wooden desk and stated that my parents were active financial predators who had used my sister as a human shield. Hearing another person perfectly articulate the exact mechanics of the abuse, without softening it or excusing it, was an incredibly powerful validation. It cemented the reality that my escape was not an overreaction. It was a basic, necessary survival instinct. While I was busy building a healthy foundation in Washington, the structural integrity of the Howard family was rapidly collapsing back in Raleigh. Distance did not soften the truth. It merely provided the necessary time for the consequences to fully mature and take root. The Community Coalition, spearheaded by Evelyn Brooks, did not let the issue fade away with my departure. They formally submitted a written demand to my parents, requiring a complete, line-by-line accounting of every single dollar donated under my name. At the same time, the leadership board at our church quietly initiated a comprehensive internal audit of the local outreach funds. Because my mother had previously volunteered to manage the petty cash and donation collections for various parish events, her current financial scandal cast a heavy, undeniable shadow of doubt over her past activities. She was quietly, yet firmly, asked to step down from all committee leadership roles pending the results of the review. The pressure was not limited to my mother's social circles. My father was discovering that his preferred method of loud, aggressive denial held absolutely no currency in the professional world. He worked as a regional director at Halcyon Ridge Logistics, a mid-sized supply chain management firm where lucrative local contracts relied heavily on personal reputation and community trust. Raleigh was a large city, but the corporate network was remarkably small and tightly knit. The whispers regarding his frozen bank accounts and his attempt to embezzle his own daughter's community scholarship had steadily crept into the country club locker rooms and the weekend golf games. Men who used to clap him on the shoulder and share industry rumors suddenly found excuses to cut their conversations short. My father was learning the hard way that in a community built on appearances, being exposed as a thief is bad, but being exposed as a thief who steals from their own child is a permanent, unforgivable stain. The most bitter consequence for my family, however, was their absolute inability to blame me for any of the fallout. When the final payment deadline for Delaney's prestigious summer theater showcase officially passed, she permanently lost her spot in the program. In the past, my parents would have easily spun this as a tragic sacrifice made necessary by my selfish behavior, but the paper trail I had left behind was bulletproof. The community knew the bank accounts were frozen because my parents had deposited checks fraudulently. They could not point the finger at the daughter who was hundreds of miles away, quietly attending university classes. The crisis was entirely contained within the walls of their own home, born entirely from their own specific choices. The final, undeniable proof of that premeditation arrived in my university inbox midway through October. The sender was Delaney. The email contained absolutely no text. There was no greeting, no apology, and no explanation. It contained only 3 attached image files. I opened the first attachment. It was a high-resolution photograph taken of the glowing screen of our shared family tablet. The image displayed the sent folder of my mother's ancient, supposedly abandoned email account. The second and third photographs zoomed in on a specific automated confirmation message from the Georgetown University Housing Department. The timestamps on those emails were the most damning detail of all. They explicitly proved that my mother had successfully executed the password reset and officially submitted the request to change my dormitory status to deferred exactly 5 days before the graduation party was canceled. My mother had not acted in a moment of panicked desperation after Delaney started crying on the stairs. She had methodically dismantled my college exit strategy almost a full week in advance. The tears, the sudden cancellation, the dramatic speeches about family harmony. It was all a carefully choreographed stage play designed to cover up a financial crime that had already been successfully committed. Delaney did not send me those photographs out of a sudden, noble desire for sibling solidarity. I knew her far too well to believe she had experienced a miraculous moral awakening. She sent those files purely out of self-preservation. For weeks, she had been trapped in that house, watching the social and financial walls close in around her. She had realized that as long as the timeline remained slightly ambiguous, the town might still secretly believe that her emotional outburst was the true catalyst for the entire disaster. She was being positioned to take the historical blame for the collapse of the family reputation. By sending me the absolute proof that the sabotage was premeditated by our mother long before any tears were shed, Delaney was officially cutting her own ties to the sinking ship. She was refusing to be the public face of their private sins. I downloaded the 3 photographs, categorized them, and immediately forwarded them to Evelyn Brooks and the Coalition's legal counsel to be added directly to the formal restitution dispute file. Armed with that specific, irrefutable digital evidence, the sporadic messages I still received from my mother transformed from merely annoying to deeply pathetic. She continued to leave voicemails and send long, rambling text messages trying to reconstruct the bridge she had burned, but she never actually took accountability. She constantly used passive, slippery language. She called the stolen checks an administrative oversight. She referred to the housing portal manipulation as a technological misunderstanding born out of maternal anxiety. She talked endlessly in circles, desperate to manufacture a version of reality where she remained a good, well-meaning parent who just made a small mistake. But I had the ledger, I had the bank records. And now, thanks to my sister's instinct for survival, I had the explicit digital proof of premeditated sabotage. Every single time my mother refused to call her actions by their true names, her apologies became significantly cheaper, lighter, and completely meaningless. She was speaking to a daughter who no longer existed, trying to maintain a lie that had already been entirely dismantled by the truth. By the middle of December, the chill in the air matched the absolute freeze covering my family's social standing. My mother, entirely incapable of existing outside the warm glow of community approval, made one final desperate attempt to rewrite the narrative. She decided to host a private winter fundraiser at the local community center annex. She branded the evening as a small, intimate gathering to support Delaney and her supposedly interrupted artistic journey. It was a thinly veiled attempt to generate fresh sympathy, cast our family as victims of circumstance, and quietly pull the neighborhood's attention away from the glaring issue of my stolen college funds. What my mother fundamentally failed to realize was that her carefully curated guest list for this new event was almost entirely composed of the exact same people who had generously donated to my graduation fund just a few months prior. She was inviting a room full of people who were already holding polite but damning email receipts, canceled checks, and a growing, collective sense of outrage. Aunt June and I drove down from Virginia on the morning of the event. We did not go to the house. We did not announce our arrival. We were not there to initiate a chaotic brawl. We were there to be physically present when the ultimate reckoning was placed directly on the table. When we pulled into the community center parking lot, the winter sun had already set, casting long, harsh shadows across the frosty pavement. I stepped out of the car, holding nothing but a single, incredibly thin paper folder. My heart beat with a steady, calculated rhythm. I was calmer than I had ever been in my entire 19 years of life. We walked through the double doors of the annex just as my mother was stepping up to a small wooden podium at the front of the room. The space was decorated with cheap winter garlands, and about 40 people were seated in folding chairs, holding paper cups of warm cider. The exact second the heavy doors clicked shut behind us, the low murmur of conversation instantly died. The silence that swept through the room was absolute and suffocating. My mother froze. Her hands gripped the edges of the wooden podium so tightly, her knuckles turned completely white. My father, standing near the refreshment table, went entirely rigid. Before my mother could stammer out a greeting or attempt to spin our sudden appearance into a happy family reunion, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks stood up from her seat in the front row. Evelyn was the head of the community sponsor group, and she commanded the room with effortless, terrifying authority. She did not yell. She spoke with a polite, measured tone that made her words completely unavoidable. Evelyn announced to the entire room that before any new financial appeals were made for the Howard family, the Community Coalition was formally pausing all local educational and artistic donations. She stated clearly that this freeze would remain in absolute effect until the previous thousands of dollars collected under the name of Sienna Howard were fully and legally accounted for. My mother let out a small, breathless gasp. My father immediately stepped forward, his face flushing dark red, puffing his chest out in a desperate attempt to regain control of the room. "This is completely inappropriate," my father commanded, his voice booming across the silent room. "This is a private family matter regarding a simple management mix-up. We were simply consolidating household resources to best support both of our daughters during a highly stressful transition." Evelyn did not even look at him. She walked directly to the podium, stood right next to my paralyzed mother, and calmly opened a leather binder. She placed a stack of documents flat on the wood. She laid down the printed bank summaries showing the diverted deposits. She laid down the clear, undeniable copies of the cashed checks bearing my mother's signature. Finally, she placed the printed email from the Georgetown University Information Technology Department, explicitly detailing the unauthorized, premeditated access to my campus housing portal originating from their home network. The room was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the heating vents. The sheer volume of documented proof sitting on that podium completely annihilated my father's weak excuse about a management mix-up. Then, the final, fatal blow came from the very person my parents had spent their entire lives protecting. Delaney had been sitting quietly in the second row, her head bowed. For weeks, she had been trapped in a house buckling under the weight of social exile and financial audits. She had been forced to realize that she was the designated human shield for a massive betrayal. She suddenly stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. She did not look at me. She looked directly at our mother and father. "Stop talking," Delaney said, her voice shaking but carrying a sharp, desperate edge. "Just stop lying." I cried on the stairs that day because I was jealous and I wanted attention. I admit it, but I never once asked you to steal her money. I never asked you to hack into her college account. I never told you to cancel her future so I could have a party. The impact of her words physically staggered my mother. She took a step back from the podium, covering her mouth with her hand. Delaney had just publicly destroyed the very last defensive shield my parents possessed. For my entire life, they had justified every unfair decision, every canceled event, and every act of neglect by claiming they were simply protecting their fragile, highly sensitive younger daughter. Now, that same daughter had just stood up in front of the entire neighborhood and violently ripped that convenient excuse away, cornered, exposed, and entirely out of options. My mother finally broke. The elegant, controlled facade completely shattered. She looked at the faces of her friends, her neighbors, and the church elders, and she began to cry. It was not her usual, calculated weeping. It was the ugly, panicked sobbing of someone who had been caught. Between broken breaths, she stammered out a pathetic, fragmented confession. She admitted she had taken the envelopes because she wanted to keep the family financial situation flexible. She admitted she felt losing me to Washington meant losing control, and she had let the plan go entirely too far trying to force me to stay under her roof. I walked slowly down the center aisle until I stood face to face with her. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not celebrate a theatrical victory. I looked at the woman who had spent 19 years keeping me small, and I felt nothing but a profound, hollow exhaustion. I handed her the thin paper folder I had carried inside. It contained the formal legal demands drafted by the coalition attorney. "From this exact moment forward," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through her sobbing. "Every single interaction between us will be strictly in writing. Every single dollar you took will be repaid directly to the trust according to this legally binding agreement. And you need to understand one final thing. Any apology you ever attempt to send me that does not explicitly name the exact crimes you committed against me is completely and utterly meaningless." I turned around and walked out of the community center. Aunt June followed right behind me. We got into the car and drove back to Virginia in the dark, leaving the ruined wreckage of the Howard family reputation far behind us. The true closure arrived 3 days later, back in my dormitory at Georgetown. It was a freezing, crisp Tuesday morning. I woke up to a notification light blinking on my mobile phone. It was a voicemail from my mother. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed and listened to the recording. Her voice was flat, defeated, and entirely stripped of any manipulative warmth. She did not make excuses. She finally spoke the 3 explicit truths I had demanded. She stated clearly that she had stolen money that did not belong to her. She admitted that she had illegally tampered with my university housing records to sabotage my departure, and she confessed that she had deliberately used Delaney's emotional vulnerability as a weapon to cover her tracks. I did not call her back. I simply saved the audio file, dropped it into the encrypted digital folder on my desktop, and closed the laptop. I put on my heavy winter coat, grabbed my backpack, and walked out of the dormitory building. I stepped onto the historic campus, my boots crunching softly against the frozen grass. The air was sharp and biting, but it filled my lungs with an incredible, expansive lightness. Looking up at the grand stone architecture of the library, I finally understood the absolute magnitude of what I had accomplished. I had not merely packed a bag and moved out of a toxic house. I had meticulously, legally, and permanently escaped an entire psychological system that had been specifically designed to feed off my silence. I was finally, truly free. Thank you so much for listening to my story until the very end. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with everyone. Do not forget to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and click the hype button to help this story reach even more people who might need to hear it.